Early on in the story of Final Fantasy XVI, we are introduced to the main female character of the game's story, Jill, who quickly establishes herself as a major ally to the game's protagonist, Clive Rosfield. But at some point in the game, she becomes less relevant to the game's main plot and becomes increasingly more of a plot device with time. So what happened to cause this? Please note that this video discussion will contain major spoilers to Final Fantasy XVI's main plot, so this is your spoiler warning. We are introduced to Jill as one of the main characters during the introduction of the story in Rosalith, as a friend and almost like a sibling to brothers Clive and Joshua Rosfield. It is clear from early on that she loves Clive dearly, and prays for his safe return to Meteor when Clive is instructed by the Duke to carry out a mission. After this, we don't see her on screen again until we encounter her as a dominant 13 years later. And this is already the start of the issue, having Jill be entirely off screen at questionable moments in the game. Even Torgal is present at Phoenix Gate, prior to the events that take place. Clive gets roped into the Sanbreque army and then seemingly forgets that Jill exists. Even during the encounter with Jill, Clive takes quite a while to recognise her, despite her having similar colour clothes and hair, just being older and taller than she was during the early stages of the game's story. If Jill was like a sister to Clive and the key love interest, then surely Clive would have recognised her sooner, even 13 years on. Clive clearly remembers Joshua when he sees Joshua at Drake's head, but the Phoenix feathers are a pretty big clue also. So why does Clive take so long to recognise Jill? Flashback scenes and sequences could help with this. We have this in game with Dion and Joshua, which really help with certain plot points or understanding a character or relationship with said character better. But very rarely do we glimpse any scenes of Jill without Clive being present or regarding Clive, if at all. We are told of Jill's past and what's happened, but not really shown anything in-game. Jill could have spoken over a flashback sequence of what actually happened to her and the pain she went through, which would have helped the audience to connect with her. For example, during the scene where Clive and Jill speak for the first time upon being reunited at the hideaway, or when Clive and Jill journey to Drake's breath to confront her past. But instead we are only told through exposition for the most part. There could have been a meanwhile sequence of cutscenes following the Phoenix's apparent death, showing Jill being captured, but again a missed opportunity. Eventually Clive and Jill enter into a relationship, inevitable given how much they care for one another. Arguably, Clive still loves his brother Joshua far more, as a brother of course, so we never really feel the emotion as much with scenes between Clive and Jill, more so from Clive's side. This isn't helped by Clive's own struggles with summoning Ifrit, which seems to get much easier later in the game once he reunites with Joshua, and while Joshua is under threat. This is perhaps due to the presence of the Phoenix somehow encouraging Ifrit to appear, and the Ifrit Risen story arc that appears in the fight with Bahamut through to the game's final boss encounter. The Ultima story arc is what really shelves Jill as a character. Jill is very unimportant to the Ultima story besides being a dominant of Shiva, and even this becomes less of a factor when she willingly gives her icon powers to Clive when Clive can't be Barnabas or Odin. Prior to this, Jill does let Clive and Joshua escape when Barnabas bests Clive the first time round, but then becomes captured and needs to be saved by Clive later. Otherwise, at this point in the game, she is off screen on the Enterprise for an extended period of time. Again, no meanwhile cutscene to show what she's up to, until she reappears in Stone here to help fend off the Akashic enemies. There are several hours of story gameplay here where we do not see or hear about Jill at all, while Clive, Joshua and Gav journey across Ash, and Clive defeats Barnabas or Odin for the final time. Ultima as a villain only really cares about Clive, and to a lesser extent Joshua, so he takes both of them into the interdimensional rift, leaving Jill behind to be off-screen yet again. Whenever Ultima tries to get inside Clive's head, it is almost always Joshua, or the thought of Joshua, That breaks Clive free from Ultima's advances. It is never Jill. Some of the off-screen issues can be explained by the fact that Jill is recovering from the curse brought on by using her icon powers. But honestly, this is a very cheap explanation, as other characters, especially male characters, grin and bear it and continue to be present in the storyline for better or worse. So there are a few issues here. Firstly, Jill is only ever important when Clive is present and is off-screen otherwise. Even her revenge story arc she had Clive present for, and even then Clive did much of the hard work to fulfill her story.
Here! Use this.
Sid. We're one step closer to freedom.
The crystal. What did you do to it?
Oh, we destroyed it.
What? Monster! Monster! Do you have any idea what you have done?
I do, Father. I have killed the monster and become an outlaw. May the blessing of the crystals go with you.
It's over.
It is.
And Shiva exacted her price.
She did.
Again, the burden fell to you.
And I bore it willingly. This was a sin for which I had to atone. Now I can continue at your side with my head held high.
As such, as a character she is too dependent on Clive to be relevant to the plot. Secondly, and this may be a stretch, but maybe Clive doesn't love Jill as much as we think. Clive has his own goals and purpose in the story which takes centre stage, and though Jill is a key ally, her story and motivations have a fairly minor impact on the overall plot of the game, save for a few convenient instances where she uses her ice powers to get out of tricky situations for herself and her friends. And last but not least, much of Jill's backstory we are told through exposition rather than shown. Some of the most powerful scenes in the game are events that we the audience are shown, so if we are only told what happens to Jill over dialogue after the fact, it just doesn't have the same impact. It could also be argued that the Brotherhood storyline between Clive and Joshua was so powerful that it overshadowed much of Jill's presence in the game, especially later. It was great that we got those scenes between just Clive and Joshua by themselves, but it also meant that we may have lost touch with Jill, which again wasn't necessary. This is all a shame, to be honest, given the game's conclusion. Jill's sadness upon realising or assuming that Clive is dead should have hit a lot harder for the audience. Some of her earlier scenes had some potential, this being more evident with the knowledge of the full story and ending, but that potential never quite materialised. We do have a side quest near the game's end concerning Jill, But again, this has very little effect on the story and is a very weak attempt to make the character seem more important at the game's conclusion via an optional side quest. While Jill did have great music themes to contribute to her scenes with Clive, I do feel that if I rewatched a timeline of Clive and Jill's scenes with no music playing in the background, that it would be a very different experience, and the points I have made thus far in this video would be much more evident. Of course, Jill isn't the only female character who missed out on potential through the game's plot. Benedikta had a very short but sweet tragic villain story arc early on in the game, but this could be further explored through a prequel DLC in the future. Benedikta had a lot of potential as a character, and we saw the end of her story arc, but it would be great to see more of her and how she came to be that way in a future DLC.
It's all right. They can't hurt you anymore. Come on, let's go home.
Is this it, Adolphus? My punishment for not listening to you?
Why? Why did you have to listen to him? Benner. This can't be what you wanted, can it?
Anabella also had huge potential as a villain during the introduction of the game, but for the most part she remained off-screen, commanding soldiers to attack and kill innocent civilians. Her scene with Clive during the Bahamut encounter was well worth the wait, and the script and voice acting was among the best in the game, but equally Anabella could have been much more to the plot. Again, a primary issue like with Jill was being off-screen for far too long. Overall, I just can't help but feel that Jill could have been so much more to the plot than she ended up being. She was meant to be the main female protagonist and a love interest to Clive, but ends up being a fairly forgettable character due to either being unimportant to the main plot or just simply off-screen too often. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this video and discussion. Do you agree or disagree with the points I have made? What did you guys make of Jill as a character in Final Fantasy XVI? Do you think any other characters in the game missed out on their potential? Anyway, be sure to like, comment and subscribe. Take care and goodbye.